big topic I know we wanted to hit today is that of tool consolidation. That is, people that are looking at AppNet and considering it have probably 214 other tools they're already using to do some kind of monitoring.
That'd be a
So
reduction.
what is it that I could can I do some consolidation if I use AppNeta for monitoring? That's the question.
Well, the answer crisply, yes, absolutely. And we're finding this more and more that other systems, other tools are being either turned off or not renewed in the case of SaaS-based platforms. And they generally, as no surprise, falls into the monitoring bucket. And it's because of the breadth of the platform and the 4 different monitoring visibilities that we deliver, that other types of tooling, which just might not be applicable when you think about infrastructure-based measurements, is that really going to be something you can action when you have a lot of remote offices or thousands of work from home users? And you really want to understand what's impactful and what's impactful on end user experience. And so those tend to be the first class of things that get reduced, and you focus your infrastructure type monitoring on the key parts of your business, maybe your data center, or maybe very large regional offices where you have a lot of infrastructure still in your control. But those tend to be categories where we see reduction.
I also think some reduction happening with just sort of understanding the nature of how applications are delivered means that some of the tooling you have today may not be well suited to the changing way in which applications are delivered. Like Greg had mentioned before, like if you've got a really well instrumented data center, it means you're looking at everything up to your edge. But now that you're adopting more and more third party and moving applications to the cloud and kind of getting out of the data center business, whatever that might be, some of these tools are no longer well suited to the job, no longer like this hub to spoke type of monitoring type of scenario. So taking that approach where you're measuring the end user kind of solves for that challenge of some of these tools not like surviving this journey.
It really comes down to this transition from device-centric monitoring. So, we've had this sort of like poll the SNMP, and okay, so we made SNMP better by putting it into some API, which is probably using Yang. Okay, so the integrity of the data got a little bit better, and we got a little bit more sort of, but it still doesn't solve the problem that there are places in our networks or in our systems, in our IT infrastructure, that aren't devices. You can't do an SNMP poll of the AWS gateway or the Azure LAN, right? You can't do an API call to get stats. You can do, there's some early attempts by cloud providers to do flow export from certain systems. So you could do some analysis that way, but they're fairly rudimentary still. What about if you suddenly need to set up a data center at Alibaba in China and the rules are all different? How do you put tools in place in locations where, and this is going to be a problem going forward, where the politics is going to restrict you into what you can do in certain geographies. We're seeing this political fracturing. Instead of there being one internet, we're going back to where the internet was back in the 1980s, where all the internets were little isolated islands with little bridges between them, and things were restricted and prevented. And so you actually need a tool which is, or you need to be thinking about a tool which is a lot more flexible than the old days of the, polling of device-centric monitoring. And this is where AppNeta talks about visibility. And I think we're going to be talking more strategically about observability, which is a much bigger topic. It's the evolution away from visibility tooling. Observability is my network performing badly? Yes, it is. Well, what's the cause? Is that because my router's, CPU is pegged at 100? Is it because of light? There's a whole bunch of, and that's the next phase, and that's an iteration. But that's what you need to be thinking about strategically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that speaks to the other half of the ROI equation. I mean, you can certainly think about ROI in terms of tool reduction, and it pays you in many different ways. Obviously, the cost of the tool itself, the distraction to the IT teams of having to manage and understand and keep up with multiple tooling. And of course, just the underlying platform requirements of these tools need to run someplace. And whether they're, on-premise or SaaS-based, there is a cost that comes from running those. So there's the first half, which is reduction. But then there's the second half, which is every enterprise is going through, Greg, to your point, dramatic change right now. And as I take on multi-cloud, and I think about direct internet access, and I think about SASE and all these things that you need to be thinking about as an IT leader, I want to be able to understand that I've got a monitoring fabric that's going to be able to flex and burst with me without having to go buy yet another.
You're always going to have multiple panes of glass, but there's going to, the thesis that AppNeta would put out is that you're a big piece of the glass. So it's a stained glass window. The question is how many pieces of glass are in your stained glass window, right? And you're always going to have your AWS tool set and your private cloud tool set and your legacy tool set and your Google tool set, but you're also going to have, and that's little pieces, but in the middle, there might be a pretty big piece of glass making up most of the panes of glass that does most of what you want. And that's where you focus your efforts. You don't, sorry, Ethan.
Well, I mean, the one thing we haven't taken on head on is that SNMP. We've mentioned it in passing as like, it's the old thing that's going to go away at some point. But my beloved SNMP network monitoring station, is AppNeta going to replace that? Can it actually do all of those things? That device-centric monitoring, which is still important, does AppNeta make that go away? Because either the data it gathers obviates that, where I don't need to be so concerned about device stuff, or is it complementary?
No,
I believe it's complementary. I believe that I think we believe that it's complementary. Just to extend on Craig's thinking about the stained glass window, you also have like almost like a stack, some kind of stack of monitoring tools that are fit for different purposes. And I don't think device management is going anywhere. Like server management, device management, you're going to always need a solution. If you have devices, you need to know if their power supplies fail, and you need to know if memory's gone bad, or those questions will always need to be answered. But there also has to be a complementary view to how applications are being delivered and how end users are experiencing that, because the device management doesn't answer those questions.
Yeah, so Ethan, to your question, do we do that today? No. And is that a top concern of ours with our customers? It isn't, because of John's answer. It's very rare, very, very rare that we'll walk into an organization that isn't already on their 7th or 8th device management platform of choice. And we try to all of them. But to try to take that on right now, when you think of the panes of the glass, that's one pane that we're happy to let someone else own.
I think it makes sense logically too, because if you've got the higher level diagnostic, remember what I said about career enhancing moves? If you've got the data saying there's something wrong, you can drop into the device monitoring tools and start checking your router performance and how many packet drops per interface and that sort of stuff. It's not exclusive. It doesn't have to be exclusive, is it? Yeah.
And to that point, depending on the use case, there absolutely can be infrastructure related items that AppNeta does solve and will continue to invest to solve more in the future. And work from home comes to mind. I mean, if you think about the problem that IT is facing right now, it's blown up in their face. I took 100 offices and now there's too many tens of thousands of individual locations. And IT doesn't want to own that user's home network, but they almost can't not have some level of visibility there. So we think this is a place in particular where the value of our endpoint agent, not only to measure just the layer 3 network and the end user experience, but we can also give IT some visibility into things like, what's my Wi-Fi performance? Is my host workstation performing adequately? Those are all things that should be within the same, let's just call it the same trouble ticket, so you don't have to jump across systems. And those would be very use case specific, where we will dive into deeper into the infrastructure, but we will never, I won't say never, it's highly unlikely we will become a general device management platform. That's just not in our future.
Thinking about ROI and wanting to elevate your career, obviously you're gearing the metrics and the reporting you're doing towards IT folks who need to troubleshoot problems. But what about on the business side? Do you have metrics or dashboards or reports that are going to make sense to an executive who just needs to know, are my end users happy and being productive?
Yeah, what a great question. It's interesting when we're working with some of the world's largest companies today. IT is leading the investigation. IT is leading the proof of value and then the final decision on the tooling. But the value that's being consumed is absolutely done by the business unit level and either senior IT or their peers across the business. And we have many different forms of output analysis which are designed to be consumed and leveraged by a non-technical user, just to answer the really basic questions like, how am I doing? How's Zoom operating across the enterprise today? How are all my collaboration tools operating across the business today? And those are things that, you know, any platform of merit that scales has to be able to speak to the non-technical user. And that's built into the AppNeta platform today.
I think too, as we get into the larger and larger enterprise, one of the things that actually happens is they don't want to consume it from our UI. Like that goes, as the enterprise size goes up, the access to the UI at the business level goes down. They're just like, I don't want to see your report, just give me the data. We're going to be pumping this into our BI system. We're going to be using our dashboards. We're going to be wrapping this with other pieces of information from the enterprise. So just like, shut up and give me the data is kind of what's happening as we get into the larger and larger spaces.
Sure.
We got one more question from the audience that kind of goes back to an earlier part of our conversation, but it is about how monitoring is done within different cloud providers. So Karen's asking that we have monitoring points inside of Azure, or at least that's what came across in the conversation. How do you get the monitoring point IP so you can participate in that?
Well, it depends whether you're going to do outside in or inside out monitoring. So we tend to believe very much in an inside out approach, which is the origination point where the monitoring point run is pointing out to something. So it would very much depend upon the user's deployment. But if I had a monitoring point deployed inside of Azure, for example, I could point that out to other known targets that I know I want to measure to. So in the case of worrying about PII, I could just hit the outside interface of all my end users' home routers and do it from that cloud access point and say, I understand the connectivity from the cloud to that home user and just use the outside interface. If I want to go the other way and I've established VPN or some other kind of nailed up overlay network into the cloud provider, that IP address of the monitoring point, it instantly becomes available to the AppNeta platform as a target that you could source from outside and point back into the cloud. So both directions
outbound connections versus inbound connections.
Well, there's a point of clarification here. Is there something AppNeta is providing itself that offers those IPs? Or Matt, it sounded like you were talking about monitoring points that I, as the user of the AppNeta platform and deploying my own monitoring points, would be deploying.
Yeah, that's use case one. That's a fair question. Use case two would be we actually have pre-deployed global monitoring points that are just up and running that users can tap into and say, I want to pick a generic location in London and compare that to London, to Germany, to China. Those are available to all of our customers today. And those are good to get an approximate location performance, like how does my performance feel today, presume from London. Okay. But we honestly believe that inside out, like understanding my performance from London is important, but I want to understand my performance from Piccadilly Square on the third floor of building number 202. And that's where we tend to push our customers towards the idea of monitoring from the inside out rather from the outside in. Many of our competitors rely successfully on outside in, and it gives you a good general picture, but it's not as actionable because I'm only getting down to a general location. And we all know networks, that last mile, or to Adam's point, that last foot matters.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's multiple ways to get this done then, because Karen's citing a specific use case of they've got domain controller up in Azure and want to monitor that connection to make sure the connectivity to the DC is good. It sounds like we got several ways that we can get that done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.